Okay. Today, this month, our session is on Akegarasu Haya. And when I was going through the schedule, I said like Kaneko and Soga and Yasuda, they were very challenging for me because there's not enough, not much out in English about or by them translations. But I thought, oh, Akegarasu, I've been familiar with Akegarasu for quite a long time. But now I'm discovering it's not, he's almost still as unknown in many ways as Kaneko, Soga, and Yasuda, that the real Akegarasu, a lot of what Akegarasu is about has yet to be, even by myself, has yet to be explored. So I'm kind of looking at him in a different way than I used to look at him. So I just check on who's okay. Oh, and then I have where it says Harry Kigoshi, that's Professor Yasushi Kigoshi that from Otani University, that you can wave to them, but he was the president of Otani University, but now he's a visiting scholar at University of California in Berkeley. So he's joining us from Berkeley. But when it comes to Akegarasu, his family lives in Kanazawa, the area that Akegarasu is from, and his father arranged for me to visit the temple, and Kigoshi sensei drove me there, so he knows that we had a very interesting visit at that temple. So I'm going to share my screen. Is that okay? Let's see, get that on there. Okay. Share slideshow. Okay. Okay, I hope everyone could see that. So Haya Akegarasu, I call this session Chicago Connections and Corrections. Corrections being, I'm going to be talking about how some of my ideas of Akegarasu have changed, and what I feel is we have yet to really explore a lot of aspects of Akegarasu Sensei. So to start with a brief biography of him, he's, like I said, Kanazawa area, which is the western coast of Japan. And it's very significant that his father died when he was still very young. I think by not having that father figure connecting him to the tradition, like most ministers in Japan, I think that does play a part in him being a lot more open to Kiyozawa Manshi than he might have been. So in 1893, he was going to what I think we would call a high school level school in Kyoto, and Kiyozawa was teaching the English class. And so the story is that he hated English, he hated Western culture that was invading Japan at this time. And he was hoping by going to the Buddhist school in Kyoto, he would avoid all that, but that didn't happen. He was required to take an English class. And being the rebel that he was, when he was called upon in class to report on the reading assignment, he said that he didn't do it. But something happened in that encounter when he, as a rebellious teenager, declares, I didn't do the assignment. Something happened in Kiyozawa's reaction. We really don't know what it is, but it's almost, and we're going to be talking about the larger sutra later, but it's almost like for the first time in his life, he encountered someone who was what you call Tathagata. He was the suchness, a person of suchness, a person, what you see is what you get, that a real one, a real genuine person that most of the time, especially the role of teacher and student in school, everyone's kind of, a teacher puts on a certain mask and certain demeanor, but something about Kiyozawa's reaction to Akegarasu, he realized this was a man that wasn't letting his ego get in his way. He just was like I say, suchness itself. And so Akegarasu was so moved by this, by meeting this very genuine seeker. in this context. It was kind of, you know, interesting that the subject that he hated, it turned out the teacher was the person who would become his teacher. So he followed Kiyozawa, and then as he went to college in Tokyo, he joined Kiyozawa's group there. Kiyozawa had become the president of Shinshu College, which later became Otani, but one of his conditions was it had to be in Tokyo, not Kyoto. So he got all these young students to follow him to Tokyo, and they formed a group called Kokodo, and they lived together, and they opened up for public lectures, and they also published the Seishinkai magazine that we looked at when we were talking about Kiyozawa. And so they call that movement the Seishin Shugi movement. And so Akegarasu became known as one of Kiyozawa's most closest disciples, and was seen as the leader of the Seishin Shugi movement after Kiyozawa passed away. So he was looked up to as the leader of this group. And he became very popular using Kiyozawa's way of presenting Buddhism. But he admitted later, when he looked back on that time, he was really still caught up in the Tokugawa type of Buddhism, that feudal period Buddhism, but he was just using Kiyozawa's language and presentation that sounds so modern and up to date to really sell something that was not what Kiyozawa was talking about, but it was really more the traditional, or the traditional for the Tokugawa Edo period kind of Jodo Shinshu. But he was quite an engaging speaker, very charismatic. And as what happens even in our society, there's a lot of people who become these religious figures that people look to. Like in our lifetime, we talk about televangelists, these people that become very popular on TV by preaching the gospel. So a reporter for a newspaper called the Chugai Nippo, they still have it in Japan. It's a newspaper that reports on religious affairs. One of the reporters, he already knew this was pattern. If somebody is too good, a preacher is too popular and too loved, it's too good to be true. So he was kind of a muckraker, this Matani person that. So he thought he'd look into Akegarasu's background to see if there is something there that makes him less than this great hero that he was being presented as. And he wrote a couple of exposés on the scandal that he uncovered about Akegarasu, about his personal life. And so just like some of us remember not too long ago, someone like Tiger Woods, that famous golfer, you go from hero to zero, like overnight. And that's what happened to Akegarasu. He was this popular speaker and much admired. And then after these exposés came out, he was like dirt. He was exposed as a phony and immoral person and things like that. And so he said he pretty much went into hiding, isolating himself in his own temple back in Kanazawa. And he even said he was so depressed that he thought of committing suicide, or he thought about running away to leaving Japan. But the thing that kept him at the temple alive was his mother, that he felt he had to be there for her, to take care of her. So in a way, he said his mother's the one that gave him reason to stay in Japan and a reason to keep on living, even though he felt miserable. And he wrote about how the Tanisho for up until that time was a great source of strength for him. But now when he's going through this very grave depression and being so humiliated, he said the Tanisho stopped speaking to him. He didn't find anything in the Tanisho to help him with this depression that he felt, this sense of worthlessness. But then he noticed reading Jodo Shinshu, you're familiar with Shinran's compilation of all these quotes. he noticed that Shinran was always continuing, even from the get-go. Shinran said the larger sutra is the great teaching. The larger sutra, the larger Sukhaphati Buddha Sutra, the main Pure Land Sutra. So he noticed Shinran kept saying that, and so he thought he'd take a careful study of the larger sutra. And by reading the larger sutra through his sense of depression and humiliation and all the thing that he just went through, it really spoke to him. He thought like being on the bottom of a pit, and all of a sudden something happens to bring him back up to the light. And so he expresses his gratitude for the larger sutra in these 3 works. He wrote a lot of things, but he Kosei no Zenko, which is like before and after birth, and then Zen Shin Surumono, the one who goes forward, and then Dokuritsu Sha no Seigen, the declaration of an independent person. And so in these 3 works, and from that time on, he was very different person than he was before. Now he knew that larger sutra was the basis of the teachings, and then he suddenly said he understood what Kiyozawa was getting at, that Kiyozawa was getting at to this going back to the Buddha, going back to Shinran, and not being caught up in the feudal age type of Buddhism, where they talk about the afterlife savior and those kind of things they distract people from the real here and now sense of liberation, of the spiritual breakthrough. So he became this very dynamic person that just came back. And so even that reporter from the Chukai Nippo came to really admire him. He said a lot of people, you expose them and they just disappear, but Akegarasu came back as a authentic person. He came back as a real teacher from that time on. So you can see from the 1920s on, he was quite active, not only through Japan, but he did travel to China and other places, and of course the United States, where he met Gyome Kose. But he, just so people know that toward the end of his life, he did serve as a chief administrator, the Socho of Higashi Honganji. So he did have that position at one time. And one thing about Akegarasu, as opposed to Kaneko and Soga, he had an early influence on the Jodo Shinshu in America. And if you look at the book called Immigrants to the Pure Land, written by Reverend Michihiro Ama, I think some of you are familiar with that book. He talks about how Akegarasu was at the time, like the 30s and 40s, very well known in Japan, and he influenced several ministers who became the ministers in United States. And one of them was Kyogoku in the Fresno area, but the other one was Hata Sensei, who was in the Bay Area, and that's who Reverend Gyome Kose met and became introduced to the works of Akegarasu. But just to know that among the Japanese speaking ministers, there were people talking about Akegarasu in Nishi Honganji. Okay, so these were all Nishi Honganji ministers that were talking about him. And there was an early English translation, Akegarasu, it's called the Selections from the Nippon Seishin Library. And he said, reason why he had this English translation done was a man in Ogden, Utah, Issei, first generation Japanese guy, said, like, Sensei, your teachings are so great, but these Nisei people, the second generation people, they don't really read Japanese, and they don't really understand Japanese so much. So can you have something in English put out so that they can be introduced to your presentation? So he did come up with this book. He used various translators. All these sections are done by different translators, including Reverend Hata in this book. And so I did get a copy of it through Mark Uno when I was in Kyoto. He got me a photocopy of that book. And it is quite amazing because even though he does include Tanisho and writings by Kiyozawa, his own pieces that he includes in this book is really unvarnished Akegarasu. And you see two aspects of Akegarasu that I wasn't familiar with before then. And one of them is his nationalism. So he was known, when I went to Japan to study, they only teachers I heard talk bad about him because they considered him an emperor worshiper, that he was so attached to Japanese nationalism. So that comes through in that early translation, 1936. But the other thing that comes through, and I think a lot of you are familiar with that, is that in Japanese culture, as opposed to our American culture, talking about bodily functions is not a big deal, and particularly sex. Whereas in America, we had this puritanical idea that if you're going to talk about religion, you can't talk about that dirty stuff, So that's a thing that comes up in his writings, and it's for him, and probably for most Japanese, it's just natural to talk about the bodily functions such as sex and being naked and body parts and stuff like that. But that's what's in that translation, 1936 translation that he had produced. So that is an evidence that he did have an influence in America from before the war. So as you probably know, the story is through Reverend Hatta in the Bay Area, Reverend Gyomi Kuosa met Akegarasu sensei, and then he was so taken with Akegarasu that he went to Japan and studied with him, and then came back to America. So I was going to say, look at that picture of Akegarasu, very famous picture of him. And now you're going to see this picture reproduced two different ways. So one is the Fundamental Spirit of Buddhism book, and the other is Shout of Buddha, which I hope a lot of you are familiar with. And so what happened in Chicago, especially for 1977, was coming up the 100th anniversary of Akegarasu's birth. And so Reverend Saito was working towards that date to publish an English translation of Akegarasu. And also Reverend Kuose at the same time put out his translation. And I call it the rival teams of translators because as far as what I heard, they did not work together. Two separate groups at our temple. Both groups were active in a group called American Buddhist Association. Even early in the 50s, the Buddhist Temple of Chicago had people who are not Japanese American attending the temple, and they didn't feel comfortable socializing with Japanese Americans in the men's group, the women's group. We have a group that still exists now called Asoka, which was formed by the Nisei couples to help the temple. There's the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, martial arts, judo and kendo. But these were all activities that were primarily or mostly for the Japanese American. Most of the people in those activities were Japanese American, but this group of people who came to our temple who were not Japanese American, they thought they'd make their own group, and that was the American Buddhist Association. But the two factions were quite different. The people that followed Reverend Kuose, they really put an emphasis on meditation, whereas Reverend Saito followed the famous poet Miyazawa Kenji, in that he felt arts were really the best expression for Buddhism, not meditation. And so he encouraged people to express themselves through music and poetry and things like that. So you probably are aware of one person from Reverend Saito's influence was Joseph Jarman, the jazz musician. So just to know that, yeah, so Chicago did produce these translations, but they were done by two different groups. And one thing that Reverend Amma brings out in his book, The Immigrants to the Pure Land, is a problem many ministers are familiar with it. Even now, those of you involved with temples, I know that you want to attract new people to your temple. You're happy to welcome new people to your temple, but people aren't coming to your temple to hear about Shinran. In fact, I don't know if you can let me know if there's been cases in your temples of someone showing up the door saying, I'm here because I heard about Shinran. I really want to learn about the Nembutsu. I haven't heard of cases like that. Usually someone comes to your temple saying, I'm curious about Buddhism. I want to learn more about Buddhism, and meaning that broad topic of Buddhism. So Reverend Amma says, even from the early, what they call missions, the early temples that were set up in Hawaii and the West Coast, in trying to be open to newcomers, and even to the Nisei, the second generation people, they realized that a lot of your job is just explaining Buddhism, just introducing people to what Buddhism is about. Who is Shakyamuni Buddha? What were the basic teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha? And so there was this emphasis, you could see it in the works that they did in Hawaii, that it's just all about this, what they call basic Buddhism, about Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, and his basic teachings. And not so much about Jodo Shinshu and Shinran specifically. So there's this tension, Amma Sensei puts out, that the ministers and just temple members in general are they have to sell Buddhism. So both Reverend Kubosa and Reverend Saito were in that position in Chicago, that they both, I think, thought that Akegarasu would be the perfect vehicle to help people be introduced to Buddhism. And even though he's a Jodo Shinshu minister and talking about Jodo Shinshu teachings. So I think both of them were excited that Akegarasu's writing would be this nice vehicle for people coming to the temple to learn about just Buddhism. And both of them, it's very apparent in the translation, they didn't want to get into the details of Jodo Shinshu, the details of what Shinran talked about. And particularly in the Shadow Buddha, I realized when I started reading the Japanese version, what happened is after Reverend Saito died in 2001, some of us thought, and I'm still thinking about it, doing a retranslation of some of the works in Shadow Buddha. So Joanne Sweeney, who was helping Reverend Saito, she herself didn't have much background in Buddhism and almost zero knowledge of Jodo Shinshu. And Reverend Saito, when he came to America in 1956, he didn't speak much English or understand much English. So you got these two people working on this translation, and he's very excited and trying to convey to her, what his teacher is talking about. And to her credit, she did try to learn Japanese, though, Joanne Sweeney, but not to the level where she could really read Akegarasu directly and get much out of it. So these two people are working together, trying to put Akegarasu's words into English. And one of the things I realized when I was in Los Angeles, one time Reverend Saito said, "Oh, here's a piece by Akegarasu. Can you translate it for a study group?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I was thinking Shadow Buddha. Akegarasu writes in such simple language, such straightforward, down-to-earth language." No, he doesn't. he writes in what I call literary Japanese, because he's kind of a poet in his background, and using kanji, the Chinese characters, a lot of them I've never seen before. So luckily, when I took Japanese at University of Minnesota, we learned how to use a Japanese dictionary. That came in handy. But Akegarasu's actual writing style is not like you see in Shadow Buddha. He is very literary. He uses a very fancy vocabulary. And the other thing that struck me reading the Japanese, he makes continual reference to the larger sutra. it's the larger sutra that inspired him, that really brought him back to life, that really gave him this sense of liberation. So in all his writings, especially Shadow Buddha, most of the writings come from the Dokuritsusha no Sengen, the Declaration of Independent Person. So there's this continual reference to the larger sutra, and even putting in expressions and references to the larger sutra. But if you read Shadow Buddha, you don't see that. You don't see any of those technical terms from the sutra. You don't see much mention of actual Jodo Shinshu concepts. I don't know if they did do a follow-up book called Reverberations, but Joanne Sweeney, not having a background in Jodo Shinshu, misinterpreted some of the things Reverend Saito said. So he mostly said Hozo Bosatsu, the Dharma Bodhisattva, but she was writing it as Dhammakaya, which is body of Dharma. So there's a lot of these mix-ups going on in this English translation, which that's one of the reasons I feel it would be good to make a new translation of Shadow Buddha. But for the time, and I'm saying for Kubo Sensei and Saito Sensei, for that time, 1977, they both felt it wasn't good to go into those technical Jodo Shinshu things, because the audience they want to attract are just people curious about Buddhism, and they want to touch something that sounds like Buddhism to them, and it could be very inspirational to them. So that's kind of the background of those books. So today I wanted to go into detail about one of the pieces from Shadow Buddha. And this is a piece called The Pigeons. And so I kind of want to discuss, I'm just going to be kind of paraphrasing it. One of the things that struck me looking at the Japanese is there's an introductory paragraph, pretty much what you see on the screen. But after that, it's all dialogue. It's very lively. It's like watching a movie or something where it's just people, or the pigeons, not people, but pigeons are talking to each other back and forth. But I could see Reverend Saito trying to help get Joanne Sweeney to write this out. And he said, well, pigeon this says this, and the other pigeon says this. And she probably said, too many quotations. So they actually wrote their version of it more as a narrative, not so much as this continual dialogue going on in the Japanese version. So I'll read this kind of fast. Long time ago, there lived a flock of pigeons ruled over and guided by their pigeon king. Their life was interesting and free. Since no one fed them regularly, they occasionally went hungry, but they led an exciting life. One day they were enjoying themselves in the garden which belonged to a feudal lord. Suddenly one of them noticed that many beans had been scattered on the white sands of the garden, and he told the others about it. All, even the king, flew down and began to eat. As they ate, some men who were there scattering around more beans and wheat grains. The pigeons ate until they were so full they could hardly move. One of them cried in delight, they must have found paradise, Gokuraku. They had all the food they wanted without having to look around for it. Another suggested that the feudal lord who fed them so nicely must be Buddha. We're in the compassion of the Buddha then. We can spend our lives peacefully and happily with no trouble. We should be grateful. So that's this fairy tale they start off with. But a black pigeon began looking around him. Suddenly he saw that without their knowing, the whole flock had been covered by a huge net. He cried out sharply, "Look what's happened. We've been caught in a net. We won't be able to fly in the open skies anymore." The other pigeons began to ridicule him, calling him lunatic, pessimist, crank. They insisted that the net had been put down to protect them from the hawks that might try to attack them. In that section where the Joanne Sweeney and Reverend Saito only put 3 of the ridiculing things, but actually the whole list of them, and even names I never heard of, but it's just, they were just throwing all this bad mouthing at the black pigeon. And one thing that occurred to me when I was reading the way they were attacking the black pigeon verbally is Kiyozawa, that maybe these were things Akegarasu had the intense criticism that his teacher received during his time. So I couldn't help but think, yeah, in a way, the black pigeon is representing Kiyozawa, someone that's saying, wait a minute, we're going about it the wrong way. And so they said the black pigeon gave up eating and grew thinner and thinner, but the other pigeons got fatter and fatter. Each day the men came and took away the fattest pigeon. The other pigeons were envious, thinking it was for a promotion, but the black pigeon noticed the men's clothes had blood and feathers sticking to them. He warned the other pigeons. Then he slipped through the meshes of the net and flew up and away into the blue sky. So you see what's going on here. The black pigeon gave up eating and got skinny enough to slip through the net. But the other pigeons thought being fat was a good thing, that they get to be promoted. Finally, the king of the pigeons spoke. Now are you waking up a little? You abused him when he tried to tell you the truth, but he saw everything quite clearly. He loved his own spirit, his true self, but you loved an easy meal and a safe place where you could be lazy. By getting thin, he has gone straight into life, and you, by getting fat, are headed straight for death. I haven't eaten and could slip through the net at any time, but if I left you, I'd be worrying about you and what was happening to you. Give up this greed. When you get hungry, just look at the great free sky and you won't want any more of that filthy food. I'll stay with you for as long as it's necessary. When you're thin enough, we'll all escape together. So here the king is saying he's doing like the black pigeon, but unlike the black pigeon, he's going to wait for the other pigeons to get skinny so they can escape together. So from that moment on, none of them touched the grain of food. Eventually, the men stopped collecting the pigeons because there were no fat ones left. Days passed, and finally, every one of the surviving pigeons was thin enough. Then the king led them to the meshes of the net, and they all flew up into the great wide sky. So this is just a paraphrase of this story. But as you hear about this story, and some of you have probably read it already, what do you think about it? What is Akegarasu saying to us? So he talks about the great wide sky. That's the symbol for liberation, but what is it exactly? You know, it's a nice image, but what is he talking about? And when we say liberation, freedom from what? And in the story, it's the meshes of the net. So what I used to think, and I think a lot of people still think this way, is that the story is about escaping the trappings of institutional organizations and having a more free kind of Buddhism. And I could see where you could say, well, you know, temples, they feed us really good. They have lots of nice luncheons, and but it's like a big net in that once you're trapped in the temple, you got to be volunteer and you got to do this and that. They got you hooked to do all this work. And I've seen that at our temple. People just get burned out. Some people, they do join and they become volunteers and they get burned out. So some people might think this story is about that the temples are this diluted sense of being fed well, but it's really sapping your energy away. And so the great wide sky would be a way to practice Buddhism without those trappings. So I think that's kind of how I saw the story, and I think that's how some people still maybe think of the story. But one thing I look at is Akegarasu uses this term shukyo kusai, and it's religion as an ego trap. And so kusai means, you know, stinky. So the stink of religion. And I went to see a speaker one time in Kyoto. I was told about him because he's very unconventional. So he would represent somebody without the trappings of the traditional trappings of the way temples are supposed to be. He was very animated. You know, he unlike a Japanese speaker, he told a lot of funny stories. And at the end of his talk, he wanted to go around and shake everybody's hand. So I thought he was kind of different from normal Japanese speakers. He's very entertaining. But I was telling one of my friends at Otani, I said, oh yeah, I went to see Reverend so-and-so. And that person said, Akegarasu called that particular teacher Shukyo Kusai. And then I realized what that term meant. It meant someone who's using religion as a way to build up their own ego. So even though this guy's putting on a very entertaining presentation of Buddhism, it's really a way to get everybody looking at him and admiring him and enjoying themselves hearing him. And so even his going around shaking hands with everybody, it was not really about giving us teachings, but about having us look to him as our good buddy or our friend or someone that we find very attractive. So I thought that was interesting. The friend at Otai told me that's a guy that Akegarasu called Shukyo Kusai. So I realized a lot of Akegarasu's translated words can be used to justify this. I call it make it up as we go along Buddhism. I don't know if some of you at temples are familiar with, maybe not at your temple, but you probably have heard of Buddhist groups that seem like they're making it up as they go along. I was at an event with a Muslim group one time, interfaith event, and one guy said he went to a temple. It wasn't our temple, thank goodness. But when he asked the speaker, what kind of texts or scriptures, do you base your temple on? And the guy said, no, it's whatever's in our heart. That's what guides us, whatever the way that we go through life and listen to our heart. And this Muslim teacher said, he's just shaking his head, said, what kind of religion is that you're just going by what's in your heart? And I told him, well, to me, that's not Buddhism. Buddhism, we do respect the scriptures. We do have texts. We do have a lineage of teachers that help to guide us. And so that's what Shinran and the larger sutra, Shinran pointing to the larger sutra, guide us to have a sense of what the teachings are really about. They don't want us to be, I guess for Shinran especially, warns us about those ego traps, that we have to hear that there's this other power beyond our ego self, that there's this other way of seeing the world beyond our self-centered way of seeing the world. Without that guidance from Shinran and the larger sutra, I think so much of Shadow Buddha sounds like make it up as we go along Buddhism. I could see where people could kind of take it that way. And so Akegarasu then becomes this icon for people who I call self-appointed gurus, that they think, well, Akegarasu makes it sound so easy, it's so direct and so simple in a lot of ways in his expression. You just have to listen to your spirit. So even in that pigeon story, the king talks about the black pigeon as someone who listened to his spirit. So there's that kind of almost like an egocentric kind of Buddhism coming out in the way people are interpreting Akegarasu's works. But if the black pigeon really represents Kiyozawa's pointing to our true self, which is beyond the ego self. He's pointing to this larger perspective that we get from the sutras, what we get from Shinran, that goes beyond just hearing what we think our heart is saying. What a lot of times what we think is our heartfelt feeling is really just our the cogs of our ego calculating what's good for us, what's profitable for us, as opposed to what's not profitable for us. So always protecting this ego. So that's one of my fears, is that Akegarasu, because of the way it was translated, we're not getting enough of that message of Shinran and the larger sutra. And so one of the projects I hope to start maybe late this summer or in the fall is to look at the larger sutra through the words of Akegarasu, or to see how Akegarasu why the larger sutra was so impactful for him to get out of this terrible feeling of depression that he had. What is there in the larger sutra? And one of the clues is the phrase he uses, that he even has a big sign on his temple that says, "First know yourself." Whereas in the English translation, the larger sutra, you don't even see that translated. It's kind of hidden in some bigger sentence. And but the fact that that particular phrase where when Dharmakara asks his teacher, Lokeshwara Raja, where do I start? How do I get like you? How do I find that sense of liberation? And Lokeshwara Raja, from Akerasu's view, that's the first step. First, know yourself. And so knowing yourself is to kind of see where the ego keeps trapping us, and the real spirit of liberation is not getting a chance to come out. And so the larger sutra, especially like in the 48 vows, or we chant Tambutsuge and Sansege, it's kind of telling us of this deeper aspiration. And one of that part of that deeper aspiration, that sense of community, of true relating to other lives with a sense of identification. And I think not enough of the translation that comes through that true teaching, deep teaching from the larger sutra doesn't come through in some of those translations. So that's one of my projects I'm thinking to get into, is to really look at the larger sutra and why it impacted Akegarasu. But like I said, even that one phrase that Akegarasu puts on a big sign on his temple, you don't see it in the English translations. It's not there. It's just kind of hidden. It's kind of hidden within some other sentence. So it just means something struck Akegarasu for him that we're not getting ourselves in the English translation. So I think it's important to understand not just the sutra, but to know that it really had an impact on a living person. It really had an impact that really turned his life around. So the larger sutra does have that power. And I think by studying what Akegarasu learned from the larger sutra, it will help us to understand maybe what the larger sutra is about. So there's a lot about Akegarasu then that I think we have yet to discover. I have yet to discover and explore. The Shaolin Buddha, those early translations did do a great service for people coming into Buddhism, but it also did kind of, I call it disservice. That's why that it kind of encourages make it up as we go along Buddhism and this idea of self-appointed gurus, I think. And I, during this recorded session, I'm not going to go into that, but we can talk about, I can talk about it with some of you later, but that I can see that, and I really feel we need to get Akegarasu's real teachings out there to correct that image of him as this kind of icon for people who want to make it up as they go along. So that's the presentation on Akegarasu. I mean, I realized this, I could, talk a lot about his different things, but I do think there is a need to retranslate some of those pieces to bring out the larger sutra references, to bring out the more complex thought that he is trying to get across, where Joanne Sweeney and Reverend Saito had a hard time communicating to be able to do that. I mean, it is a great book, and I think it does have its worth, but I realize, yeah, the time has come to try to appreciate what Akegarasu was trying to get across. Next month, we're going to be looking at Maeda Shuichi, who's considered probably Akegarasu's main disciple, main student. And that's a different case where most of the translation we have are done by Nobuo Haneda. So there you have an ideal case where, a closer ideal case, where someone is deeply steeped in Jodo Shinshu, is a Japanese speaker, but also has the English vocabulary. You know, he got his PhD at the University of Wisconsin, also has the English skill too, and also help of some very skilled people were helping him too. So it's a very different situation than Reverend Saito and Joanne Sweeney trying to struggle together to get Akerasu's writing. So Maida's sensei, we do have the advantage of having a translator that I feel is giving us a direct feel for what Maeda sensei is talking about. So that'll be next week. So I would like to close out the recorded session and take any questions you